Your Bibles with me and turn this morning to Genesis chapter 3 for our study. It'll be a miracle if I can say everything I intend to say this morning and not leave something out, but may God have mercy on us. If you've been involved at all in the news cycle and the media of just this last year, when it comes to the topic of sin, you will have been privy to sin being covered up for people's own ends. You would have been exposed to people taking sin in others and exploiting it to their own advantage. You would be privy to sin being spoken of, but in a way that's totally distorted, highlighting this sin when there's a sin right next to it that person's part of that's mountains higher than this sin. But it's only this sin that gets talked about. They're actually guilty of much worse, a crime much greater, but they only talk about this. You'll encounter, just in this last year, the denial that sin even exists. And you notice that some of these contradict each other, but as Martin Lloyd-Jones said, when it comes to the devil and his schemes, he doesn't mind contradicting himself. So there's denial that it even exists, and that leads into the next one, that when someone reaches a status of success in their craft, whether it's athletics or music or whatever it is, once they attain a certain status, that person will then be interrogated to find out their views on particular subjects so that they can be discredited and their success squashed. So sin, in just this last year, gets covered up to people's own purposes. On the other hand, it gets exploited to people's own purposes. It gets misordered. It gets denied that it even exists, period. And then the person that does believe that actual sin exists gets interrogated to the point where they lose their careers. Sin. It's such an interesting thing. It's such an interesting phenomenon. Even churches can be slow to get into sin and calling it sin, calling sin sin. So I've started with the general media, I've gone down to churches, and then last but not least, there's us, individuals, who in just regular encounters with people very close to us attempt to deny our personal sin, have irrational explanations for it, and deny any culpability whatsoever. We blame shift. We do all sorts of things, and maybe the worst crime of them all is considering sin a horizontal problem versus a vertical problem. See, we are so humanistic that when David speaks of his sin with Bathsheba and killing Uriah, in Psalm 51, he says, "Against you and you only have I sinned." We live in a culture, and maybe you're part of it, that would go crazy that David didn't mention Bathsheba and Uriah. Because we're so horizontally driven. But David, the man after God's own heart, recognized that without God there is no sin. So all sin is ultimately against God. Ultimately. He was so God-centered that rose to the surface in his brain above adultery, above murder. It was the damage of the relationship with God and the offense to a holy and good God that was all he could see. It's fascinating, Genesis, of all the other ancient cosmologies, which is the study of the origin and development of the universe, cosmology, Genesis is the only one of those ancient understandings that gives an explanation of sin's entrance into the world. Other cosmologies recognize it. They recognize sin's presence. They acknowledge evil's existence, but they don't give an explanation of how it came into reality. Only Genesis does that. God makes a big deal about sin. In fact, D.A. Carson will put it this way, and I quote, "Sin constitutes the problem God resolves. The conflict carries us from the 3rd chapter of Genesis to the closing chapter of Revelation. Sin is a primary focus, the primary focus of what God is fixing from Genesis 3 to Revelation. Sin is the problem all the way through that God is seeking to resolve. And Carson will go on to say that it's not for nothing that the very first chapter of the New Testament establishes that the child born of the Virgin Mary will be called Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Sin is the focal point of the Bible, which highlights the true focal point of his son Jesus and God who sent him. But this is the drama of the Bible. Sin is that big of a deal that it takes up and has a presence in all of these pages. So sin is taken very seriously by God. And the reason it's taken very seriously is because sin disrupts God's plan. Sin disrupts the grand vision of Genesis 1 and 2, which we've spent the last 3 weeks talking about. It's fascinating. The very name for Satan that we find in the New Testament, one of his many names in the Bible, is devil. And devil comes from a Greek word, diablos. And that Greek word itself is made up of 2 Greek words, dia, which means through, and balo, which means to throw. So, diablos essentially means to throw through. And James Boyce gives the picture of you've got a window that's whole and unified, and a baseball is thrown through. It's diablos, the window. It's thrown through the window, and it disrupts the window. It disrupts the unity. And so diablos has come to be understood as essentially the disruptor. And I've stated many times before that, in Chronicles where it says that the eyes of the Lord search to and fro throughout the universe to find a heart that's yielding and leaning wholly on Him, I would say conversely that Satan's eyes work through the universe to find unity that he can disrupt. But here in Genesis 3, he found the perfect, seamless unity that would bring about all other unities in the world. It was the perfect design For God's greatest glory and our greatest joy, which are not at enmity with each other, they work together. The higher God's glory goes in our minds and hearts, the more joy we have. Satan sees that. He sees God's perfect design, and he diabloses it. He disrupts it. If I were to summarize in one sentence or one purpose statement of the last 3 weeks of messages, to say, what is God's ultimate purpose for creation? I personally would state it this way: to fill the earth with knowledge of God by means of a rest relationship between Him and His image bearers. To fill the earth with the knowledge of God by means of a rest relationship between Him and His image bearers. This is the point of creation. And Satan wants to take that and turn it completely on its head. You see, what we understand from the Bible is that angels are not eligible for redemption. In other words, once an angel falls, they are destined to an eternity in hell. There is no hope. And in that, Satan is determined to take as many down with him as humanly possible, to completely disorder the created realm and his fellow demons along with him that have fallen. So there is a deep, deep scheme here against humanity, and the Apostle Paul speaks to this scheme, and he says, we do not want to be outwitted by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his schemes. And I want to talk this morning with our sights centered on Genesis 3, and I want us to understand Satan's schemes, because I want you to know your opponent. I want you to know that this life is not a careless life that we could walk through unconscious of the threats. The Bible specifically tells us, Peter says, be sober-minded, be careful, for your adversary, the devil, he prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. This is serious business. So I don't want you to be ignorant of his schemes. So I want to look at Genesis. I want to dive into Genesis 3, and I want to talk about Satan's schemes. And I want you to see it in all its crafty detail to know what you're up against. We learned from Luke's gospel that after Satan tempted Jesus, Luke records that he left him until an opportune time. Okay? So what that tells you is that Satan's practice of temptation is to strike when it's opportune, when it's great timing, when the situation is most vulnerable. That's when Satan comes into the picture. So I want to take that scheme of Satan and I want to say, okay, let's theorize, if we can, what was possibly opportune about this time in Genesis 3 where Satan comes to Adam and Eve. What's so opportune about it? I'm going to theorize this morning. We learned from the narrative that Adam has just completed doing what? Naming the animals. So, Adam has just finished studying and classifying and naming all the animals, which was an authoritative practice. He was naming them. He was above them. He was studying them and then giving them a name. He has authority over them. God gave it to him. So he does that. Satan then comes to him as an animal, as a snake. This is interesting, And again, I'm theorizing. I'm in the theoretical realm. You can go with me on this or not. But it's fascinating to me that both David and Hezekiah, later kings in Israel, they fall when the kingdom is essentially under their feet. They're doing very well in the realm of authority, and that's when they're struck. That's when they fall. So Adam has just finished doing a pretty profound thing, classifying the animal kingdom and demonstrating his authority over them. And then Satan comes embodying a serpent. So it's just possible, we know Adam was with Eve in this moment, it's just possible that Adam feels pretty proud of himself, pretty high on himself in a way, just authoritative, not sinful yet at this point, but feeling like he's just subdued what God gave him to subdue. And the animal comes, not to him, but to Eve. We'll get to that. But he comes, let's actually get to that. He comes to Eve, but Adam's there. And it's possible that Adam said, okay, I'm in authority. I've just shown my authority. I'm okay with this conversation erupting. I have authority at this point. But the serpent comes to Eve. Now, Adam is a bit susceptible because he's just done a great thing. He feels like he's accomplished. He comes to Eve, and it's very purposeful that he comes to Eve instead of Adam. But I want you to catch that he comes submissively, right? He comes as an animal, which has just been demonstrated. He's lower than humanity. He's lower than Adam, so he comes humbly. Comes as an animal. But he comes to Eve instead of Adam. He speaks directly to her. And there's at least 3 reasons why he comes to Eve instead of Adam. Number 1, she's less familiar with animals. Adam's the one that named them. Eve wasn't even created yet. So she doesn't feel as authoritative over animals as Adam did. She's also not aware of the particular craftiness of the serpent, which was intrinsic to that particular beast of the field. So he comes to Eve. She has no authority. She doesn't feel any authority over them. So she's open, maybe more open than Adam is to dialogue. Second, she isn't the one who received the command from God to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She also didn't hear from God the generosity in God's command, which when he said to Adam in Genesis 2, you're free to eat from any tree of the garden, freely, eat as much as you want from any tree, just don't eat from this tree. She wasn't privy to the generosity of God's statement. She also wasn't privy to the directness of God's statement, for in the day that you eat of it, you will certainly die. You will surely die. She didn't hear that from God's mouth. She had to have heard it from Adam. So she didn't see God's generosity. She didn't see God's directness. And then third, she didn't experience God's exceptional generosity in giving her a partner. Only Adam experienced that. So you got to think, Adam is the one that named all the animals, and it says, for Adam no fitting helper was found. And you say, was Adam bummed out by that? Apparently so, because when God makes Eve and she brings him Eve, he says, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She's like me. So he was clearly somewhat sad that he didn't have a partner like all the animals did. And he experienced a tremendous act of kindness and grace from God. Eve didn't experience that. She was created, Adam was there. She didn't experience the longing that Adam did. So Eve is the perfect person to go to versus Adam. Satan is anything if he's not opportune. So he goes to Eve, and he goes to her as an animal, which is humble. If he came to her as an angel of anything of God's intended likeness that he created Satan in, Adam might have wanted him out of the garden. You remember Adam's job was to keep and guard the garden. So Satan had to come in a way to them that would not put them off. It would have been comfortable. So coming as a serpent was very comfortable. And what's fascinating is that his first word to Eve is also exceptionally humble in certain ways. He's asking a question. He's not making an authoritative statement against God. He's merely asking a question. He's just wanting the door to slightly open to see if she will even have dialogue. So he asks a very seemingly uneducated question. She's in the authority position, not him, of course. Did God really say, did he actually say that you're not to eat of any tree in the garden? Now, here's what's fascinating about that question. You see that he's keeping the order, he's coming as an animal, but what he's doing is actually subverting it. He's just putting in a false thought, and not just one, but two. First of all, he says God. Did God really say? When we know that when Adam and Eve were created, God introduces a new name for himself, which is the Lord God. That's the personal name. It gets introduced when humanity comes on the scene. But he doesn't want to speak about God in a personal way. So he distances it, and he says, did the higher power really say? Not your creator, not the Lord God. So he first introduces a lie about God that way, and then he actually states the exact opposite of what God said. Did he say you shouldn't eat from any tree in the garden? Of course God didn't say that. He said you're free to eat from any tree except this one. And you see, it's at this point that Adam should have immediately, Titus 3:10, Paul says, after warning him twice, don't have anything to do with a factious man. Nothing. Distance yourself from such a one. Well, Satan immediately here is being factious. He's seeking to disrupt the unity that God made between God and himself. And Adam should have immediately struck the serpent. He should have immediately crushed his head. But he's already allowed Eve to begin a conversation with him. So he's already accepted the lower role. And so now it would be him actually stepping into a conversation, and he doesn't do it. So in this question, Satan gets exactly what he wants. He went to the one that was more greatly ignorant of who God was and what God said, and now that ignorance comes through in spades in how Eve responds to Satan. Very quickly want to go through it. She doesn't acknowledge God's generosity at all. The generosity of God is lessened. She said, we may eat, but God said, you may freely eat of every tree. So it's just kind of, we can do this. It's not you're encouraged to do this. She says God back instead of Lord God, so the personal name for God's taken out from her response. Then she refers to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as the tree in the midst of the garden, when the narrator has made very clear that the first tree in the midst of the garden was the tree of life, not the tree of knowledge of good and evil. She doesn't even mention the tree of life now, and now the tree of knowledge of good and evil has replaced the tree of life itself. Then she adds a command, you shall not touch it. At this point, God's generosity is significantly lessened, and his strictness is significantly heightened. And then last but not least, the judgment of God is lessened. She says, because if we do that, we may die. Well, God said, you will certainly die. Not you might die. Here's what's fascinating to me. Do you know that if you get a bit squeamish about the doctrine of hell? Do you know that theologians have given you options other than the biblical option of an eternal conscious torment? You have options. You don't have just one alternative to that. You've got more than one. They've got names for them. You can choose. You see, the same thing is happening. Satan continually wants to heighten the strictness and lessen the punishment in every sin we commit. Psalm 10 summarizes the thoughts of the wicked man, and they are frequently, he will never come, he'll never see it, I'll never get judged. So I just want to stop a moment, and I want to count the ways Satan is winning here. You just think of Satan as a salesman, and he's making a cold call, right? Pastor Alex, for a time, did that. And he learned how to go about doing that, how difficult a job it is to cold call people for sales. It's not easy. So Satan is making a cold call, and so he comes in as someone they'd be comfortable with, an animal. He finds the weakest, most misinformed, potentially partner, and he strikes up a dialogue with a humble question, and a dialogue happens. Huge success. He's not immediately killed by Adam when he asks the question. Adam allows Eve to continue the conversation. An incredibly huge victory for Satan. In that question, he doubts God's command, he doubts his character, and that's accepted. It's not discredited. And now, Eve is in the conversation with him, and Adam, more and more and more, is getting distanced from the conversation. At this point, Adam is likely thinking exactly what Satan wants him to think, which is this. If I, at this point, speak of God, I might jeopardize the beautiful gift that God's just given me. Satan's got him to that point. Adam does not want to lose a relationship with Eve, and now he's in a fixed situation. And on top of this, Eve has shown numerous weak spots in her understanding regarding God's generosity, his character, his judgment. And so now that doubt is cast, Satan says, now I've got some promises. I've got you suspect of him. Now let me tell you the truth of the matter. You see, he came in humbly. He came in as a serpent. He came in asking a question. She's the authority figure. Now Satan is comfortable being the authority. Enough doubt has come through with her response that he's comfortable taking the offensive, and the first word out of his mouth in the Hebrew is not. Not certainly will you die. You see, God knows you will become like him, knowing good and evil. Here's what's fascinating. He's disagreed with her. So now, just like Adam's compromised, now Eve has tangled with him long enough that she has to disagree with him to get out of the conversation. She has to say, no, you're wrong. See, it's become an argument at this point. He's just disagreed with her. Not certainly. No. It's a slight disagreement, but it is a disagreement. So it's getting awkward to now disagree. And in his disagreement, and in his new proposal that he's putting on the table, he casts further doubt on her weak statement of, or we may die. And he says, no. You will not certainly die. So he takes her a step further, putting it in the unlikely realm. And then he introduces what he's offering here, which is Eve. You see, here's what's happening. Eating of the fruit allows you to define your own reality like God's defined his. See, you will have a competing reality, a one in which you may not or will not die. And then he further supports that God's against them by saying, and by the way, the reason God doesn't want you to do this is because he doesn't want you to be on that same level. So he keeps edging that this guy is a bad guy, and then he goes further and he says, once you eat of it, you'll know good and evil. And it's fascinating. E.G. Young points out that in ancient Egyptian language, the phrase good and evil essentially was a synonym for everything. You see, if that holds true with the Hebrew narrative here, Satan's saying essentially, you will know good and evil. It's like a merism saying this and that, which means everything in between. You'll know it all. And knowing is a fascinating phrase or term, because knowing in Hebrew meant intimate knowledge of, even to the point of marital intimacy. They'll have knowledge of each other. So it's a very intimate word. And what's fascinating is that when Satan says to them, you'll know good and evil, what Adam and Eve are not catching is that they'll know it from the inside. They'll know good and evil now from inside the prison versus just theoretical knowledge of it, what a prison is like before. So Satan has eschewed God from the picture. He's presented his new proposal. And the Hebrew narrative simply says, when the woman saw, which is a fascinating word in Genesis, because it's the same word that's used when Rachel saw that she had borne Jacob no children. In other words, she realized, she came to the conclusion that she was barren. She recognized it. Before, it was not certain. Now, I understand the situation. So when the text says that Eve saw that the tree was good, this is the point of I'm now stepping into the recognition that this is something that I want. I'm having it. I'm taking it. I am coming to terms with it. I'm acknowledging it. I'm accepting it. The eyes have changed. She's headed towards this tree. And it says, when the woman saw that the tree was good, I've pointed out before that up to this point in Genesis, only God has said what's good and evil. Now Eve is on par with God recognizing what's good and evil. She's rising to his status. Now, the Hebrew narrative simply says, she took, she ate, she gave some to her husband, and he ate. Just boom, 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 boom. Now I want you to see what happens. I want you to see how strategically perfect Satan accomplishes what he meant to. Look at the beautiful design of God become unraveled. Are you ready? Eve, who was given to Adam to be his help, in the words of E.G. Young, has become a hindrance. So the purpose for which God created Eve, Satan exactly flips upside down. Adam, second, who was created to lead and guard. This was his purpose. This is why God put him on the earth. And he does, by not stepping in the gap, he does the exact opposite of what God wanted. Happens all the time in male leadership. Third, God created the creation to work in a certain economy I've shared with you before, where it goes God, man, woman, animal. He completely flips that upside down with animal, woman, man, God. God's economy goes to pot. Fourth, God created Adam and Eve to have a relationship that would multiply and fill the earth. Now, they're both wearing clothes, hiding their intimate procreative parts from each other, and they're hiding. And God, when he speaks to Adam, Adam blames Eve first. So there's enmity between husband and wife, which upsets God's design to fill the earth and multiply. Satan's upended that as well. Most significantly, the relationship between man and woman and God, which was meant through a rest relationship to conquer the earth, is totally shattered. They hide from God. Adam lies to him. God says, "Why are you hiding?" Listen to Adam's response. "I heard you walking in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." What didn't he tell God in that response? The truth. That's the part that was missing. I ate from the tree you told me not to eat from. Relationship is broken, and after Adam blames Eve, he ultimately blames God for giving him Eve. Relationship is totally fractured. Now I want you to see, sixth, humanity's focal point was meant to be on the glory of God. Now, their focal point, their center, is totally self-absorbed. Adam's only thinking about Adam. Eve's only thinking about Eve. Neither of them is thinking about the glory of God. All they can think about is themselves all the time. That's what sin has done. It exchanged the orbit from around God to around self. Seventh, Adam's relationship with the earth now is bad. He was meant to protect the garden. Now he's using the garden to protect himself. He's hiding behind the trees he was supposed to protect. And then eighth, finally, as far as I've recorded it, the text records that they have opened eyes, which we will come to know as we read through the rest of the scriptures that they were actually blind. They see things all wrong now. Evidence that they see things all wrong. They're more concerned about their own consequences than they are the command that was broken. See, catch this. A.J. Young points this out. If Adam and Eve still saw God rightly, they wouldn't have hid from him. They would have run to him. Because he's the only one, as the Bible will demonstrate, that can fix their problem. So they see everything wrong. So, man's understanding of God, himself, woman, creation, the animal kingdom, has all been totally decimated. The entire design is turned upside down, and we turn the page and we'll see Cain kill Abel. We'll see Lamech turn out to be the man he is. We'll see the people of the flood turn out to be the way they are. We'll see Ham to become the person he became. We'll see that Abraham handles Sarah the way he did because it's in his heart as well. We'll see that he and Sarah together will treat Hagar the way they did because the sin's in their heart. We'll see Lot lean towards Sodom the way he did because sin was in his heart. We'll see Jacob scheme the way he did because sin was in his heart. We'll see Rachel and Leah compete the way they did because sin was in their hearts. We'll see Levi and Simeon treat the men of Shechem the way they did because sin was in their hearts. We'll see the brothers of Joseph treat them the way they did because sin was in their hearts, and on and on and on and on. But you'll stop me and you'll say, humanity's come a long way since Genesis 3. And in order to respond to that, I want to read to you from the introduction of the book Fallen, A Theology of Sin. Listen to this. Christopher Morgan and Robert Peterson write, "Invest in sin?" One online investment broker advertises a novel stock portfolio called The 7 Deadly Sins, which organizes stocks around the vices of gluttony, sloth, vanity, greed, envy, lust, and wrath. This portfolio is built on the assumption that even in a sagging and unpredictable economy, there is one thing we can always count on: sin. Listen to how the investment agency writes. Even in tough times, consumers continue to partake in things that may not be considered particularly virtuous. From cigarettes to sex, burgers to Botox, consumer indulgences require products and services from a wide range of publicly traded companies. Some luxuries see reduced demand during the tough times, but smokers could keep smoking, drinkers keep drinking, and the lustful keep lusting. Bad habits are hard to break, and when times are rough, who wants to even try? Nobody can predict the markets, but consumers are only human, and economic conditions may not be able to defeat their appetites for sinful stuff. So this investment company purposely chooses areas in the realm of vice and says, you'll do well if you invest with us. And if that weren't enough, let me read you from D.A. Carson's first chapter in the book. Only 19 years have elapsed since we closed out the bloodiest century in human history. There was not just one Holocaust. Add to the Nazi slaughter of Jews, the Stalinist starvation of 20 million Ukrainians, the Maoist slaughter of perhaps 50 million Chinese, the massacre of between a quarter and a third of the population of Cambodia, tribal slaughters of Tutsis and Hutus, and various ethnic cleansings. How shall we calculate the damage, material and psychological, of terrorism in all its forms, of unrestrained consumerism, of all the damage done by drug abuse in many kinds, including alcoholism? The digital revolution that ushers in spectacular improvements in research, data handling, and communication also brings us instant porn with untold damage done to man-woman relationships in general and to marriages in particular. Shall we add the cruelty of racism, the exploitation of the weak, and greed and laziness in all their forms? And what of those massive and ubiquitous sins that are primarily the absence of particular virtues? Unholiness, impiety, prayerlessness, unloving hearts, ingratitude. And then listen to this condemning sentence. Despite, we're just 19 years from that century, you and I. Despite the massive evidence that surrounds us on every side, many in our generation have come to think of themselves as essentially good people. The Bible tells us, do not trust your heart. It is desperately wicked. Who can understand it? It's desperately wicked above all things. And this heart is lodging within each one of us. And it is exactly what Jesus came to replace with his heart. That is the truth of the gospel. Jesus came with a heart that beat with Genesis 1 and 2. It beat perfectly in cadence with Genesis 1 and 2. And Jesus came and died on the cross to take in all of the sin we get about ourselves and all of the sin we don't get about ourselves. And he sought on the cross to take his heart and give it to us, and to take our heart and to put it into his chest. You see, the enormity of sin that came into reality in Genesis 3 was so vast and so bad and so evil that it necessitated such a strong remedy as the Trinity itself being torn apart. That's what it needed. Everything I just described began and came into this world in Genesis 3. And the fascinating thing is that when Jesus came and died for those sins, according to Isaiah 53, the prophet says that we esteemed who? Him stricken. Do you see? We are so self-deceived that everyone on planet Earth at the time of Jesus' crucifixion looked at him hanging on the cross, and all they could think of is, man, he's damned by God. Unbelievable. He must have done something awful. That's how deceived we are. And the prophet says, we, it's him, it's us, it's you, it's everyone in first century. This is how deceived our hearts are, that when we look at Jesus hanging on the cross, we would have said, what did he do wrong? The thought wouldn't even have crossed our minds that it was us that put him there. But Jesus came, his body broken, his blood poured out, saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You see, this is no cheap grace. Sin is so devastating that it took the cost of God's own Son to restore creation to its intended place. But that's actually what it did. That's what it's doing. This meal that we're about to celebrate is given to us by Jesus to say, when you do this in remembrance of me, so that it echoes and that it reverberates all the way until I come again and have this meal in person. And what does a meal represent? It represents fellowship. It represents ease. It represents the Last Supper where John laid his head on the chest of Christ. It represents that intimacy that came from Genesis 1 and 2 and was lost in Genesis 3. This is what Jesus accomplished. And this is what we are to set our sights on above all the news cycles that get sin wrong. We're to feast on this. Amen? Until he comes. I'm going to ask you musicians to come.